Welcome to those of you who have started to join for today's session. We'll get started here in about 3 minutes, so 2 minutes after the hour. If there's any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And like I said, we'll get started here in about 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks. Welcome to those of you that are continuing to join today's session. We'll get started here in about 2 minutes. So just give everybody a moment or two, those stragglers, and then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, welcome to today's session, everybody. My name is Josh Brothheim. I will be leading today's session. We're going to kind of just dive in here and get going. Hopefully you've attended one of these classes before, not this specific one certainly, but one of these classes. If you have, you kind of know the agenda, although I'm going to go over it in more detail, but essentially we're going to do some labs, some content, some slides, and then we're going to take an exam. So 3 hours together, first 2 hours for the exam, first 2 hours for the class, last hour for the exam. So as before, questions, go ahead and post them in the chat, but kind of away we go here. As mentioned, that agenda going to look pretty similar to this. So we're going to start with a review of what Cloud SIEM is, what data pipeline is, and getting data into Cloud SIEM, and we'll talk about that in much more detail. And then we'll do some labs. So we're going to be kind of alternating from slides to labs. So for the labs, we're going to log in, we're going to take a look at the UI, then we're going to go back into the slides and talk about threat investigation with Cloud SIEM. Then we're going to go into the labs and start to look at some insights. Then we're going to talk about some slides with customizing and tuning Cloud SIEM. And then we're going to do some labs, kind of see that pattern going. And then as mentioned, that exam. So we'll start now. We'll take a break into probably about an hour and 15 minutes or so, give or take. Feel free to take one earlier if you need. And let's get started. As a reminder, if you took our classes before, I was going to say yesterday, but even the past few months, we've been running this promotion. It's still active. So by taking today's class and more importantly, taking the exam and passing it at the end of today, once you do that and send the proof of it, essentially the certification, or even just the form. We actually have a form you can do now, and fill that out. You'll get a $15 Uber Eats gift card. So let me go ahead and put that link in the chat. I'll remind you about it later, of course, because that's really when it's going to be more relevant, but just so you have it in there. All right, so that's all the kind of shameless promotion. So let's start with Cloud SIEM data pipeline. And more specifically, I'm just clean up my screen here a little bit. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. And so want to start to talk about Cloud SIEM because that's the reason you're here today. So what is Cloud SIEM? So when we're talking about Cloud SIEM, what we're talking about is a cloud-based enterprise-grade security information and event management system. And so that's where that acronym SIEM comes in or stands for: security information and event management. I'm going to refer to a SIEM for the rest of today, but if you want to say it the long way, security information and event management. And SIEM's not just a Sumo Logic thing, it's a industry thing, or not industry technology thing. But that's what that acronym stands for if you're curious. In this case, Cloud SIEM is going to leverage Sumo. Let's see, we see your note. Let me see here. Let me share the screen here. I'm going to share the slides, the notes in a little bit. Let me go ahead. There we go. So you should see my screen. Let me just move some things around. Thanks, Vishal. That might have had the wrong screen going. There we go. Okay, I think we're good now. Cool. All right. So as I was saying, Cloud SIEM, it's going to take or leverage Sumo Logic's core functionality, which is going to include data collection, ingestion, storage, and threat intelligence. And you may have seen examples of that in other classes or just using Sumo Logic on your own. Cloud SIEM is going to be a purchased add-on with an ever-expanding library of content that's designed for security operations. And because it's designed for larger data volumes, most organizations need to ingest a large amount of data each day for insights to surface in Cloud SIEM. So what I want to present now is that Cloud SIEM data pipeline in all its glory. Now, as we see here, there's a lot going on. Cloud SIEM is a powerful tool. It's going to take millions of log messages and funnel them down into a handful of actionable security insights. So going from millions of messages down to essentially a handful of, as described, actionable security insights. So how does that all work? Well, we're going to start at the top of the pipeline. There we go. And so first, the logs are going to be collected and ingested by Sumo Logic into messages. You may have dealt with collection ingestion before with Sumo log messages or metrics, similar concept, but essentially the data is out there. It needs to be brought into Sumo Logic and collected. Now, once those logs are collected and brought into Sumo Logic and turned into messages, then they're going to be parsed. Let me get that second line going there. There we go. They're going to be parsed, mapped, and enriched into Cloud SIEM records. So those logs are ingested into Sumo Logic, turns into messages. Those messages are then going to be parsed, mapped, and enriched, and now they're going to become Cloud SIEM records. Now, once they turn into Cloud SIEM records, the records are going to be compared to rules. If a rule is triggered, an entity is going to be extracted, a severity score is going to be assigned, and a signal is going to be created. And we're going to talk about those in more detail, but let me just repeat that. So once again, after the records are compared to rules. And if a rule is triggered or matches, an entity is going to be extracted, a severity score is going to be assigned, and then a signal is going to be created. Now, if we have enough signals with the same entity clustered together, they are going to become an insight. Now, for today, we're going to focus on, or for today's class, we're going to focus on the later stages of this pipeline. So essentially the bottom half of this pipeline, this portion and this portion, there we go, are what we're really going to be focusing on today. If you're interested on the collection side of things and the parsing and the enrichment, that's where our Cloud SIEM administration class is going to be appropriate for you. So this is the Cloud SIEM fundamentals. Cloud SIEM administration is that next level. So certainly if you're interested in that top half, please take it. I'll kind of mention it later as well, but today we're covering the bottom half. All right, so let's get into more detail, really on the whole pipeline, even though we are just covering that top half, that bottom half, let's cover it all kind of one more time. So for this example, and we're just going to use our company of Sumo Logic Coffee as an example, just for a few moments. Imagine Sumo Logic Coffee collects and ingests millions of log messages into Sumo Logic. Now, typically, if you're utilizing Sumo Logic, you can use those messages right away in Sumo Logic apps and start to query them and utilize the apps to investigate what's going on. But to do so in Cloud SIEM Enterprise, your admin is going to need to enable data forwarding. Your admin will also need to enable or create log mappings, field extraction rules, and other pre-processing steps to extract the right data. Once again, we're not going to cover that in any more detail today, but that's going to be an important process of Cloud SIEM, is taking that data, enabling the data forwarding and then utilizing the log mappings, field extraction rules, and starting to get that, that data parsed out as appropriately. Oop, my mouse is jumpy today. Now, before Cloud SIEM can generate security insights, these log messages need to go through some processing first, and we're starting to describe it with the field extraction rules, but there's more than that. Cloud SIEM is going to process the messages into records. And when it does, each record is going to contain the information of a message, which is going to be parsed into key value pairs, mapped to the Cloud SIEM schema, and enriched with other data. I'm going to show an example of that because that's a lot to say. So once again, the Cloud SIEM is going to process the messages and turn them into records. And when doing so, or during the process of doing so, that record is going to contain the information from the message. It's going to be parsed out. It's going to be mapped and then enriched with other data. So let's look at a better example of that, or just an example of that period. And so here I have, there we go. On the left-hand side of the screen, I have a simple log message that's going to follow or flow down this pipeline. So first, what I have is the message is starting to be parsed and extracted from the record. Then what is happening is starting to be mapped into a set of key value pairs. This process is also going to help us with some basic formatting. This step is going to create semi-structured data. And what's happening here is instead of the system recognizing or viewing something as we see on the left-hand side of the screen as IP-127-0-0-1, the parsing step is going to extract the IP address and turn it into that key value pair, which is what we see on the right-hand side of the screen. So now what we see is instead of IP-127-0-0-1, we see source device IP, and we see a value of 127.0.0.1. And what has happened here are those hyphens are normalized into dots. And so all this information is going to be now mapped onto the Cloud SIEM schema. And so we're taking our messages like we do with logs and parsing them and viewing them a little bit differently, not viewing them differently, that's not, but formatting them so that we can handle them more appropriately. Now, finally, I had mentioned that enrichment step. Right now, I'm just showing up to the mapping step. But with the enrichment step, what we can do is the record can be enriched with information from match lists or threat intelligence databases, such as threat level. And so what we're seeing here, for example, is this IP, which as it should be of a private IP of 127.0.0.1, is being viewed as a threat level of low. If it was a threat level high, we might need to take a different action, but that's where we're starting to get into that. Now, once all this parsing, mapping, and enrichment occurs or is completed, then these normalized records are going to be sent down the Cloud SIEM pipeline. And when they do, they're going to be compared to rules. So what we're going to talk about next is that next level, and this is where we're really going to be focusing more on today, is going to start to focus on rules. So each record that is ingested into Cloud SIEM is going to be compared to hundreds of built-in and custom rules, actually both. So we have built-in rules and some custom rules, and we're going to talk about both of those today. If a rule triggers, regardless of if it's built-in or custom, an entity is going to be extracted and a signal is going to be created. So what I'm showing here, there we go, are the idea that the records are starting to be compared to rules. Keeps jumping. Records are starting to be compared to rules. So if a record matches the criteria specified in a rule, then Cloud SIEM is going to start to create a signal. And the severity is going to be a number between 1 and 10. And we're going to talk about these numbers in more detail, so you don't need to worry specifically about the numbers. But what's going to happen is when the record matches the rule, Cloud SIEM creates that signal, and that severity between 1 and 10 is going to tell Cloud SIEM on how serious the potential threat is. 1 being kind of benign or not too bad, and 10 being, bad. And when that signal is created, it's going to contain a name, an entity, a severity, a stage, and a description. And we're going to look at all that in-app soon as well. A signal is always going to contain, at minimum, an entity and a severity. Now, I've alluded to, or not alluded to, I've mentioned the phrase entity a few times, and I haven't really defined it. And I should have probably done it earlier, but let's go ahead and do it now. What we're referring to when we talk about an entity is it's like a noun, or more exactly like a pronoun. It's going to be the who. It's going to be an IP address. It's going to be a MAC address. It's going to be a host name. The entity is going to tell us who or what was involved in the event that the record described. And those entities are going to be extracted from the records. Every signal is going to have an entity, and the entity's activity score is going to be the sum of all the severity scores of all the signals it appears in. And we'll talk about that math of the entity activity score and how it gets added up shortly. The math is quite simple. It's just basic addition, but we'll look at that with a better example shortly. But essentially what we have occurring is, as described, we have our records that have been parsed out and cleaned up, essentially. They're compared to the rules. If the rule triggers, that entity, that who, that what, that IP address, that host name, whatever, computer name, whatever it might be, is going to be extracted, and then the signal will be created. And so what we're going to have are some signals. Now, signals are good, but let's go a step further. What Cloud SIEM is going to do is take those signals and correlate them into a manageable number of insights. An insight is going to be a group of signals that is clustered around a single entity. Once again, an insight is a group of signals clustered around a single entity, around a single IP address, a single host name, etc. An insight is going to be created when the sum of the severity scores of the signals with the same entity, so once again, those severity scores of the signals with the same entity, goes above a certain score within a certain time frame. Now, by default, that time frame and score has been set automatically, or by default, it's been set. The default is an activity score of a 12 within the last 14 days. So in order for a signal to turn into an insight, it's going to need to group together with other activity scores that total 12 over a 14-day period. Now that can be modified, and we'll talk about the modification a little bit, but that's really best practice. And once again, the default is activity score of 12 within the last 14 days. So for example, if a rule was triggered with a severity of 5, and then 10 days later, another rule with the same entity and a severity 5 was triggered as well, the total activity score would be 10 in the last 14 days. So an insight would not be created in that case. Now, if the rule was triggered with a severity of 6, and then 10 days later, another rule is with the same entity, a severity of 6 is triggered as well, then that would turn into an insight, because then that would be an activity score of 12 over the last 14 days. And I'll show a visual component of this once again for that math that makes it easier. Now, once that insight is created, then we can, or you can start to really just start a security investigation, start to take actions like alerting the SOC teammates, executing playbooks, whatever it might be. And we're, of course, going to go in-app pretty soon. Actually, I have one more slide. This last slide, although these quote boxes are kind of hiding it, we'll see a much better example of this in-app because it will be clearer. But what we're going to see here, and what we're trying to show here, is the entire data pipeline. And what we want you to think of it as, a funnel with your log messages going in the top and the insights coming out of the bottom. So while you might ingest millions of logs, you'll only probably get a few hundred signals and maybe a handful of insights. And the insight radar, which is what I'm trying to show here in the Cloud SIEM UI, is using that funnel shape from a top-down perspective. As you go towards the center, there's going to be fewer items. So what I see here on the outer ring, these blue, dark blue lines. And if we look at this, you can look at it as a clock. So what I see here is the outer edge represents the records that have been ingested. The dark blue line here is showing the relative number of records in the last 24 hours. So at the very top is kind of like midnight, and we go clockwise around the clock. What we're seeing here in a couple places are some peaks or spikes and dips. And what that's representing to us is when more or less records than average were ingested. So for example, at the very bottom here, I see a peak in a spike, or peak, I guess, of this blue line, meaning at that moment there were more records ingested than normal. Okay, that's good to know. In the middle portion of the circle, I see the signals represented by these bars, these aqua blue bars, I guess we can call them. And what those are representing are the signals. And so what we see, kind of the same idea, is around the bar, we see when signals are being generated in a probably about a 15-minute time period. But we can see sometimes there were a lot of signals, sometimes there are fewer. Now, the innermost circle is really the most important portion. And what that is representing are the insights that have been correlated from those signals. Now, I have it in my notes. I'll read it just because it's on my screen, but I'll show an example later. But it is possible that triangles may represent two or more insights if multiple insights are generated at the same time. But essentially what we're seeing here is the outer ring is representing potentially millions of log messages. The inner ring or middle ring is representing hundreds of log messages or hundreds of records. 100 signals. Sorry if we're being correct with our grammar or our terminology. These are signals at this point. And then what we see is potentially there's only 5 insights. And that's great. That takes those hundreds of millions of log messages and distills them down into essentially 5 things that we need to look at, which is much better time-wise, more effective. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to bring us into the system. So I'm going to do 2 things here. We can do them both at the same time. The first is I want you guys to log in. If you've logged into our classes before, you kind of know how to do this. We're going to use the training plus analyst number account. So training plus analyst, use a 3-digit number. The password is going to be logs 2022 exclamation point. So let me go ahead and paste this in the chat. Feel free to log in. If you need help getting logged in, let me know, of course. At the same time, what I'm going to do is also share the lab guide with you. So I'm going to put that in the chat. Here it is. Okay. All right. So what you should have is the credentials and then the lab guide. Go ahead and log in. And as you're doing, thank you. Oh, good. Everyone's starting to put your number in the chat just so I know you logged in. It's just kind of good confirmation for me. And then the other thing is make sure you can access that lab guide. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to log in. So let me go ahead and that should disappear. All right. So going to service.sumologic.com, doing training plus analyst. I usually use 234 for no good reason at all. Typos. And the password of logs 2022 exclamation point. Feel like I have a typo in there. Cool. Right. So if anybody needs help, please let us know. Odell has joined us, which is great. So he'll be assisting in the chat as well. So feel free to ask questions, but it looks like everybody's pretty much logged in. I'm going to kind of assume so. Yeah, I'm going to assume that. So once you get logged in, you should be familiar with this interface to some degree. If you have things open, I would encourage you just to close them. They're really just not needed right now. So just to clean up the screen a little bit. And I want you to grab that lab guide. Where's mine's hiding over here. And so let's see, just try and get some real estate on here. Okay. So with the lab guide, so the lab guide should be in the chat. I'll go ahead and post it in there again. Okay. And so with the lab guide, and I'm going to go through each lab. So if you can't access the guide because you can't download the PDF, if you just follow along, we'll walk through it together as well. So you'll still be able to do some hands-on keyboard. But what we want to do first is lab 0, which is logging into the training environment. So you've kind of done that already, sort of joking, sort of not. You are logged in, but we want to just continue and get you into Cloud SIEM. So by default, you're in Sumo Logic, but not Cloud SIEM. And so on the far left, you should see the black bar. If you don't see the black bar, so for those of you, I just want to make sure some of you can access that lab guide. What I put in the chat is a PDF. And so hopefully you can access that. You can also access it. Let me see if this works real fast. I just want to make sure we're all together. So let me just see if I can show this to you real fast. Web-based. Thanks, Jen. Interesting. Not interesting. Well, yeah, interesting. Let me just make sure this is accurate before I tell everybody to go here. I just concept fundamental. Okay. Actually, let me try. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Let me try copying this address to you. So, ooh, that's probably not going to work. What you can do, let me just show you those steps that I just did, because that will work. So for those of you that can't access the lab guide for whatever reason, well, the web-based Zoom is a good reason, go to the certification tab and go to Get Certified. It's going to take a moment to load, but that's okay. Once it loads, you're going to go to Recorded Live Training. And I believe Odell showed this yesterday, and other instructors do as well, so this should be not totally new to you. If it is, that's fine. Go to this class that we're doing today, which is the Cloud SIEM Fundamental Cert Jam. It does make you register, as you saw when I first did it. Let me pause that so you don't hear me, or I don't hear myself. And what you have access to here are two things: the slides, which are good, and then the lab guide, which is probably more important for right now. Sammy, if you're having problems, if you could just tell me kind of what problem you're having. I'd encourage you to try a different 3-digit number as well if you're still having problems. All right, so hopefully we're all together now, and we can access the lab guide through this interface I just showed you. Just going to pause one more second, make sure we're together. Okay, I think we are. So I'm going to close this because I don't really need it. But what I wanted to do and want you to do is now, in the left nav bar, find Cloud SIEM Enterprise and go ahead and click on it. And I need to, sorry about this. Let me just do something. This is a internal Sumo issue. I need to re-authenticate. Oh, there we go. Oh, that didn't do it. Let me just do this real fast. I'm sorry, I should have done this at a time. All right, so once again, click on Cloud SIEM Enterprise, and what you should get is something that looks like this. Cool. So hopefully, I think most of us are there. And so that's what we're looking at right now. And so what are we looking at? Well, let's start to talk about it. This is the Cloud SIEM heads-up display, or HUD as it's often referred to. We want you to notice on the very top left is a link to get back to this HUD. So as you start to navigate through the system today, or just in general, if you want to return back to this front page, go ahead and click on that top left Sumo. The environment, we're going to look at the Cloud SIEM, the HUD rather, excuse me, and the UI in Lab 1. So we're going to start to do that right now. But just with the Insight Radar, just to talk about it just for another moment, and we're going to do some labs with it right now. But as a reminder, what this is showing us is the distilling of records down to insights. And this whole page is meant to be kind of cool looking. I don't know if the youth feel that, but it's meant to evoke not necessarily emotion, but have a video game feel. If you think of popular online video games, it's meant to kind of have that feel of a heads-up display. And the individual who worked on this actually worked on World of Warcraft, which has been a very popular game for 20, 30 years now. And so it's meant to kind of be informative, but be helpful and be kind of cool looking. And so what we want to do is now, show you how to utilize it. So with Lab 1, Lab 1-1, what we want to point out here is this top left. And what we see here are summary statistics. By default, it's going to show us the last 24 hours. We can modify that, and we're going to do so to play with some of these labs in Lab 1. We're going to use some different time ranges. But what we're seeing here is that distilling of information down to from a lot to a little. Because what I see here is over the last 24 hours, the system has looked at 16,000 records. Of those 16,000 records, it's identified 2,000 signals. Out of those 2,000 signals, it's found 4 insights. And so essentially, as somebody who would utilize this information, I now no longer need to look through 16,000 records to see something that might be peculiar or odd or weird, and that's whatever adjective you want to use. But the system is now letting me know, hey, during these 4 points, you probably want to check those out. And we're going to start to dig into how to check those out shortly. But before we do, let's go ahead and play around with this, really with the time feature up here. So what it's asking us is, for example, how many records have been ingested in the last 8 hours? So what we could do here is go ahead, select our time filter. And what we see is over the last 8 hours, there have been 5,000 records ingested. Of those 5,000 records, there were 2,000 signals. Of those 2,000 signals, there's only one insight, one thing we really need to check out over the last 8 hours. So from 5,000 to 1 is good. That's pretty helpful. Conversely, we can take this time filter and switch to 7 days, which is actually going to really kind of show even more of the power, not the power, but just the usefulness. Here we see the system over the past 7 days has looked at 124,000 records, and it still does into 22 things that we should check out. In this case, the question is how many signals have been created in the last 7 days? And so 4,000 signals. Finally, how many insights have been created in the last 24 hours? Well, we'll go back and select 24 hours, which was the default. And now we see insights is equal to 4. We also on the left-hand side of the screen see the insights by status. As we'll play with them a little bit today, we can modify these statuses. So by default, something would have a new status. But once it is an insight, you or an individual can grab it and own it and start to work it. And so that's what we're seeing here. I log in, I see there's been 4 insights over the past 24 hours. One of them's already in progress. So one of them is being worked, and I can start to delve into it in more detail. We'll do that later, but that's what I'm starting to see here is that understanding. Now with lab 1-2, what we want to do is look at this center HUD for the insight radar. And so as I was describing earlier, we have three rings, I guess, really here. We have the blue outer ring, we have the middle light blue ring, and then we have the red. Well, it doesn't always have to be red, and insight can be an orange, but we have our triangles over here representing those insights. So for example, we want to go ahead and the lab is asking us in the last 24 hours. So we want to make sure that we're set to the last 24 hours. At what time were the most records ingested? So what we'd want to do is we'd want to look at the records line, the outer blue, and really look for the highest peak. And so what we see here, I guess, yeah, that's this, let's see. Now this one's a little higher. What we're starting to see though is when the most records were ingested. Your times might be different than mine, depending on when you, not when you log in, where you log in from. So I'm on Pacific time. If you're logging in, your times might be a little, just different, but should still get kind of the same results. Conversely, when were the fewest records ingested? So what we want to look here is for, instead of the peaks, look for the valleys. When were the most signals created? So that we're going to be utilizing the bars. Remember, this is a lab environment, so there may be some weirdness, and so that's why there are signals here, not there, but that's okay. It's just once again a lab environment. So when were the most signals created? Well, we'd look for the highest peak. They're all pretty much the same, so any of them are considered the highest. The fewest, I guess, would be that one. And then let's see, finally, how many insights have been generated in the last 24 hours? And so a couple ways to see that. One is to look at the triangles, but as mentioned, it is possible to have a triangle that could have more than one in progress. Excuse me, more than one insight. So even though there's 4 triangles, it is possible to have 6 insights out of these. That being said, that's not the case here. So how many insights do we have? We can either look at each one and see 1, 1, 1, and 1, or we can just look over here and kind of just add the 2 numbers up, or look over here. A couple of different ways to approach it. If you've used Sumo for longer than a day or two, you've noticed, that's kind of consistent with Sumo, many different ways to do the same thing. So, All right, let's see. Finally, not finally, but then let's do lab 1-3. What that's going to have us do is, or utilize, are these top icons. We're not going to use all of them today, but we're starting to now. So the first one we want to utilize is the content. When we click on content, we're going to utilize or click on rules. All right, so we're still in lab 1. What we wanted to do is we wanted to look at rules, and that's what we're looking at right now. So what I did is I went to content and rules, and now I see all the rules, assuming there's no filter in place, and there shouldn't be one. And so what I'm showing here are all those rules. So by default, there's about pretty well, most of these are default rules. So probably about 750 rules that you get essentially for free. So the system is pre-configured, but of course you can modify those, and that's some of the things we'll be looking at today. So what we want to do now is we want to just show you how to use the filter here. Filtering is always done a little bit differently, and so here we have a few different ways to do it. What we want to do here with 3A is look for all the rules that have the word or the name containing firewall. So what we're going to do is click on the filter area. And so we're going to select, if we want to look for the rules that have the name of firewall, we're going to select name, contains phrase, or actually contains, yeah, we can just do contains phrase starting with, and then firewall. And what I should get are 11 records, and you should as well. You should get the same amount as me. And what I see here are various rules that have been set up. With these rules, and we're going to go into these more detail. Again, I keep saying more detail for everything we are. But now we're starting to see the rule. We're starting to see the severity. So remember those scores. This severity is a 1. This is a 5. One is more severe than the other. One is more worrisome than the other. We also see the signals that are fired. So over periods of time, how many times has this rule essentially been triggered to some degree? And so we're starting to see that. Let's go ahead and play with the filter in another way. In this case, I'm going to remove the filter I already have in place. And what I want to do, or what the lab wants me to do, is look for those rules that have a severity score greater than 8. So I'm going to go to my filter. I'm going to go to severity greater than 8. And what I should see are 3 rules. And then finally, we're going to use the, I don't think I've talked about tactics yet. No, I haven't, but we can still do the query. We're going to talk shortly about tactics and different ways that, different tagging that gets applied to these rules. We can see an example of these tactics right here. So for example, this rule is flagging or calling this tactic of persistence. This rule is calling this tactic of privilege escalation. What we can do is we can go ahead and search for the tag contain persistence. Oh, let me see. Oh, because I have that severity greater than 8, I want to get rid of that. Let me try this one more time. Tags contain. Shouldn't have to choose that. Oh yeah, okay. So I'm sorry, I'm going to do it this way. Tactic persistence. And there we go. And I see a bunch of them, 136 or so. So just showing different ways to use the filter. Filtering is pretty important. What I want to show next is the entities tab. So at the very top of the screen, for now, we're done with content, and I want to click on entities. And as a reminder, those entities are representing those, I kind of referred to them as nouns earlier, or pronouns, but essentially those who or what's. So here we see, for example, a username has been detected, a host name, an IP address. Those are the most common types of entities, are username, host name, and IP address. And so I'm seeing some examples here. I'm seeing the actual thing, the actual entity. I'm seeing the activity score that might be associated with it. And feel free to go ahead and click around. I should have mentioned that earlier. If I click on this entity, I'm going to get more detail about it. So where has this entity shown up? In all these different places. Let's go back to the entities tab. Now, in this case, we can use our filtering again. So very similar to the way we did before. If we want to go ahead and look at the entities that have an activity score of 5 or greater, activity score greater than or equal to 5. And so here we see those two being pulled up. How many entities have an activity score of 0? Activity score is 0. And so there's a discussion of what is it? What is does an entity? What does an entity with an activity of 0 mean? And essentially, it means that it's been discovered or found, but not associated with any rules. So, all right. Let's see. I think that's it for that lab. Oh, and then finally, once again, just the fact that we can use the top left HUD icon to bring us back to the front page, which has our Insight Radar. All right, let me go back to the labs. So, or back to the slides, excuse me. So now we'll do some slides here. Yeah, there's not too many. All right. So we logged in, we did that. And so now we want to get started with threat investigations. So in this course, in this course, we're going to use data and examples from fictional companies. So here we have 3 fictional companies. We have Financial Logic, we have Sumo Pharma, and Sumo Coffee. And in this case, 3 different companies, 3 different industries. Financial Logic is going to be a major player in the banking industry. They meet all the GDPR and other international compliance standards, but worry that their big investors are still targets for hackers. We have Sumo Pharma. This is going to be a healthcare company that's going to ship prescription meds to patients. And while they meet all the HIPAA standards and guidelines, they're still concerned about data privacy. Excuse me. They want to monitor all their data to make sure their patients are safe and healthy in the digital world. And then we have Sumo Logic or Sumo Coffee. It's going to be a small business with a big tech idea, automating the entire coffee business from bean to cup. And so their concern is around consumer protections like PCI DSS. And as well, their main concern or secondary concern, but one of their main concerns is running, as it says here, a fast, efficient business and keeping computing costs down while their startup grows. So those are a couple examples we're going to utilize shortly. So you'll see those again. Now, talking about threat investigation is reactive, while threat hunting is proactive. Typically, threat investigation is going to happen in response to an alert. Once you've investigated a threat, you can hunt for similar threats and take precautionary steps to prevent attacks from happening again. Threat investigation is an iterative scientific process, much like troubleshooting. In both threat investigation and troubleshooting, you need to first monitor your system. Once an anomaly is detected, you can make a hypothesis about how it happened and diagnose the problem. And as you dig deeper, you may revise this initial hypothesis and find more clues about why or how the attack or error has happened. As you investigate and trace events, you want to try to answer as many questions as you can about the event to tell the story, such as who was behind the event? What assets did the event affect? Where did the event occur? When did the event occur? Why did the event occur? How did the event occur? And then finally, you can start to take action to resolve these issues. There's going to be many actions you can take in response to an incident. For example, in one case, you might need to work with your IT team to isolate and wipe laptops that have been infected with malware so that they don't prevent the spread of malicious code. You might need to work with your HR team to enforce mandatory anti-phishing training among all employees so you can prevent future attacks. So kind of depends. Now, Cloud SIEM is going to be able to help with every step of the threat investigation process. Cloud SIEM is going to automatically detect and monitor potential threats by analyzing millions of records and distilling them into a handful of insights with a low false positive rate, as starting to talk about already. And you can choose the insights, as you saw from the home page of Cloud SIEM, in the Insight Radar, under the Insight Activity Panel, or from the Insights panel as well. There's a few different ways to access it. Now, once you select an insight, you can then dig through all the raw logs and signals and start to conduct deep dive investigations and even proactive threat hunts. So you're going to monitor, then you're going to start to investigate. Now, during your investigation, you're going to start to organize your thoughts. You're going to make hypotheses and take notes about your investigation and put those in comments of each insight so that you can start to share your ideas with your SOC teammates and help you keep track of your investigation. You can also take certain direct actions from the insight. So you can automatically email teammates or create JIRA tickets or execute playbooks and many other custom actions within the actions button. Finally, you can update the insight. You can mark it as in progress or closed. If you close it, you can mark it as resolved or false positive or duplicate or no action. And by updating the status, and more importantly, updating the status correctly, it's going to help the Cloud SIEM Insight Engine produce more accurate insights for your org in the future. And so, of course, this process is going to repeat each day as new insights are generated for you to investigate. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is MITRE ATT&CK and what this is. And I alluded to this tactic and technique just a few moments ago in the lab, but want to talk about it in more detail. Not too much detail, but some detail. And what I'm referring to here is what's called the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. And if you notice, MITRE ATT&CK is spelled kind of funny. Attack is spelled ATT&CK. And that's intentional. It's not just a typo. What that stands for is adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. So what this MITRE ATT&CK matrix is, and it's published by a group called MITRE, that's a nonprofit research organization. Essentially what they've done is created a framework that organizes and categorizes the tactics and techniques that criminals, hacktivists, nation states, and other adversaries use. And this is going to include attacks like exfiltrating databases, installing malware, stealing credentials, and other nefarious activities that you and your teammates are trying to stop. And so Cloud SIEM is going to use these same tactic names for the stages of signals and the names of insights. If you're familiar, or when you're familiar with ATT&CK, navigating that Cloud SIEM insight page is going to become easier. Not a requirement that you memorize this or know this outside of what I just told you, but if you do, that's all the better. I'm going to put a link just to the ATT&CK, the MITRE organization, just in case you're curious. But once again, if you're not, that's perfectly fine. All right. So now that we know what MITRE ATT&CK is, now we're going to talk about some MITRE ATT&CK use cases specific to our fictional companies. So which MITRE ATT&CK tactics and techniques would our organizations want to prioritize? So for example, for financial logic, they need to keep their clients' data secure. Remember, that was their main concern. So for them, the MITRE ATT&CK technique or tactic called credential access is going to be a concern, because they want to make sure that all their customers have user credentials tied to their financial accounts and make sure that they're secure. Now, Sumo Pharma, of course, they're worried about credential access, but that's not the primary concern here. Their primary concern is that patient privacy and those HIPAA standards. So for them, exfiltration of private data is a major concern. So credential access is not as important. Exfiltration is more important. Sumo Coffee, remember, they're concerned more about resource management. Now, of course, they're concerned about credential access and exfiltration of private data, but their main concern around what they really want to focus on is execution. They are concerned about making sure that their infrastructure is, or they're concerned that their infrastructure is going to be as efficient as possible. And so execution can be a particular concern since many executable files can utilize precious computing resources. All right, a couple more slides here, and then we'll get into back into the lab. So let's go ahead and just a couple more. So the insight page is going to show you everything you need to start unraveling the security event. When your signals cluster together, Cloud SIEM is going to use the tactics and techniques to name the insights that they generate. And this naming is automatic, which is kind of cool. The insight's name is going to point us to how the event occurred or why the adversary is behaving that way. So for example, a tactic name like discovery or persistence might show us the reasons the adversary has. Similarly, a tactic name like initial access or execution might tell us a little bit about the methods the adversary used. These names are just starting points, but they can, which is good, they're starting points, and we may need to revise our hypothesis as we continue our investigations. Yeah. Now, what I'm trying to show here is not the greatest image, but what it's attempting to show is a timeline. And what the timeline is going to help us to understand is when the event occurred. What we can see here, once again, kind of hard to see, it's very blue, is we can see whether each signal was triggered. Was it at the same time or sequentially? Did everything happen over the course of days, minutes, months, or not months, but days, minutes, hours? We start to see that. And by default, the insights are going to be related signals that are going to cluster together within the last 14 days. So in this example here, we can see that some signals occurred several days before the others, but we have 3 that are clustered closely together more recently. Well, that's probably interesting, and that's what the system is starting to show us. All right, well, I think one more slide here. And this is the entity once again. So as a reminder, those entities within the signal are going to point to who, what, where the event occurred. And so that entity might be that IP address of a hacked device, the location of an adversary, the location of a database, the owner of a website, or some other piece of the puzzle. And as a reminder, each insight only has one entity it's clustered around. So what I want to do now, or what we want to do now, is investigate an insight. What we're going to do here, what we're going to do here is we're going to select one of the insights. We'll do this together. And then we're going to look at or navigate to the insight. I mean, actually, exactly says what we're going to do here right now. So let's go ahead and jump into the lab guide, jump into Sumo as well. So hopefully we still have Sumo Logic open. Hopefully we're still in Cloud SIEM. Hopefully we're still on this front page. If not, hopefully we remember how to get back to it. If you need help, let us know. And what I want to do is I want to pull up my lab guide. Now, within our lab guide, we're at lab 2. And within this lab guide, we have, for lab 2, we have lab 2A, lab 2B, and lab 2C. Representing lab 2A is financial logic, lab 2B is, I think, Sumo Pharma, and lab 2C is Sumo Logic Coffee. And I might have gone flip-flopped. Correspondingly, there's going to be lab 3. And lab 3 is going to have A, B, and C. What we're going to do now is we're going to do either A and then later A, either B now and later B, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to start with is we're going to do lab 2A, and then we're going to do lab 3A later. So let's start with lab 2A. So with lab 2A, we're going to use financial logic as our example. It says demo in the lab guide, but we're going to do it together because I think that's better use of our time. So let's go ahead and start to dig in here. So what is lab 2A all about? Well, it's about financial logic. And specifically, while working for financial logic, we receive an alert about an insight called persistence with initial access. And so what we want to do here is, as it says, find out what happened. So I'm going to move my lab guide out of the way just so I'm not taking up too much screen. But now I'm going to follow the lab guide. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go to the Insights tab, or well, I guess we can call it a tab at the very top. When I do, and I should have clicked on this earlier, I don't think I did, is I am now looking at all the insights. Your view may not be in this format. On the top right, you have the ability to show board or show list. You can use either one, it really doesn't matter. They're different, obviously. The show board is probably more useful in the long run because it's categorizing our insights. So if it's already in progress, I don't need to work with it. So that's quite helpful. But if you see it in the list view, that's why. So you can switch it back and forth. Now, regardless of which view you choose, what we want to do is we want to look for an insight named persistence with initial access. So what I want to do here is a couple ways I can do this, but probably there's a few different ways to do it. One is if I see one in a new progress called persistence with initial access, I can just grab that one. Or what we would encourage you to do is use the filter. So what I'm going to do is look for what am I looking for? Name, contains, phrase. Let's see, this should find something with initial access. And so I see these insights. So regardless of how you get there, doesn't really matter, but go ahead and select one of these persistence with initial access. Doesn't really matter if it's new or in progress, to be honest. It doesn't really matter. So I'll click the second one. Now, once I'm in here, now I'm seeing stuff. Now, what am I seeing? Well, let's talk about it. What I'm seeing on the left-hand side of the screen is the name of the insight as named by the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I see the status. I see the assignee. This has not been assigned to anybody, so I can assign to myself. I see the entity, so that's that who or what that this insight is revolving around. And then I see other stuff, other things in here. The center of the screen is where we really want to focus. What I have here is that timeline that I was describing earlier. And so what I see here is events that occurred and then events that occurred a lot later. And so let's start to try and figure out what went on here. So what happened? So we see a couple different events. We see a user received an email with a phishing link, specifically Vagrant. They received the email. Now that's concerning, and the system recognized that with a value or score of 4, saying, okay, phishing email arrived. That's like I said, just concerning. But more things happened. What we see here is Checkpoint is starting to look at this malicious file. So somebody clicked that email phishing link. We see CrowdStrike is starting to detect it. So what they've done, or what CrowdStrike has done, well, Sumo Logic has done utilizing CrowdStrike data, is identify the fact that when that email was clicked, it is trying to access or download this file. This file has, or this issue has a severity of 5. And these are starting to add up. Now it's not just somebody got a phishing link, it's that they clicked on it, CrowdStrike has identified it as malicious, and now we're starting to put these pieces together. So as it says at the bottom of this lab, what we can do here is we can scroll to the left-hand nav bar, and we can go ahead and add comments. Now, you don't have to. If you want to, feel free to. But essentially, we can start to put in what has happened. So what has happened is, as it says in the summary, a phishing link was received in the user's email. A few minutes later, a malicious file was allowed. And so it seems the user clicked on that phishing link and downloaded the file. Then the threat intelligence of CrowdStrike identified that file as being malicious as well. These two signals fire simultaneously, and so now the insight was created. And so as it says, it seems the file that was downloaded was known to be malicious. How should financial logic in this case approach this issue? And once again, it should lock the user's account and re-image their machine immediately. Vishal, great question. I was hoping you wouldn't catch it, but somebody had to. Mostly because it's lab environment. So yeah, this should actually be kind of closer to over here. It's just the lab environment is, yeah, flaky. Not flaky, that's not the right word, but dynamic. All right, cool. So, hopefully you went through that and got the idea. Let's see, time-wise, we're doing okay. So let's run through lab 2B real quickly. Not too quickly, but let's look at this. So this was Sumo Pharma. In this case, it was they were concerned about exfiltration, credential access. So if we want to go ahead and look to see what occurred here, we can go to our insights, which I did not click on. Click on our insights. We can once again do a search for exfiltration with credential access, or we can try and cheat and just scroll around and see if we find one. I'll just search. I was hoping to get lucky, but tag contains exfiltration. I don't know if I spelled that right. Nope. Exfil, there it is. So exfiltration, there should be one with credential access. If there is, yeah, there it is. There's one. So hopefully you can find one as well. We're going to click on it and kind of same idea. So we're now viewing the insight. At the top, we have our timeline. And so we're starting to see what occurred. And so what occurred, we see here, well, let's go through what we think occurred, and then we'll go through what the lab guy told us. So here we see a guard duty alert. We see some unauthorized access. And so the system thinks some instance credential exfiltration is occurring. We see some more alerts from guard duty. And notice this alert is pretty low. It's only a 1 out of a 10, so it's not too severe. But what happened here is concerning. We see some penetration testing occurring. And we see some unusual behavior. So this looks kind of scary. We see someone who kind of came in using some other credentials and is pumping a lot of data through, or a lot of traffic through. Now, what happened? Well, that's where we kind of need to dig in. But what we see here, as it says in the lab guide, is we see that unauthorized access in the form of that credential exfiltration occurring. And then we see that guard duty detecting that penetration testing from a user named Kali Linux. And then we see that high volume of traffic. Now, since Sumo Pharma is proactive in finding vulnerabilities, what had happened here is a consulting team was doing some penetration testing. And so the insight was confirmed to be part of that behavior. So what we would probably have done is gone to somebody that somebody in your organization and said, hey, we see this user doing this penetration testing. Do you know about it? And hopefully our CTO or CSO, somebody knows that this is occurring and can say that, oh yeah, this was penetration testing. If they come back and say we don't use that, we weren't doing penetration testing that day, or this is not the naming convention we normally use for testing, then this could become quite concerning. But that's where we need to decide: is the system's going to let us know it's weird, but we need to decide what to do with that weirdness, if that makes sense. All right. Let's see, I'm going to check on my slide deck. We'll probably take a break in a few moments as well, but let me just make sure we're kind of up to date. Let's just do a couple more slides here just to get them out of the way. And that way, when we come back, we'll have even less to do. And if you need to take a break, of course, please do. But let's go through this. So there we go. All right. So talking about insights, they provide a great high-level summary of potential security events. And as you saw, because Cloud SIEM's threat intelligence and sophisticated correlation engine exist, very few insights are going to be false positives. So they are all worth investigating. But sometimes you might want to investigate deeper to understand really what happened. Or you might want to do some proactive threat hunting work to find potential problems before they begin to impact your system. The Signals tab is going to be helpful here. The Signals tab is going to list all the signals created by rules that have been triggered in your system in the last 14 days by default. The signals are going to provide these summaries of potential security threats. Remember, not all signals are security incidences. After all, as we just kind of saw, there might be a legitimate reason why somebody might be logged into 2 different devices at the same time, or why there have been several failed password attempts, or why there's been a spike in traffic volume because someone's doing pen testing. So there might be legitimate reasons. When you click into a signal, you're going to have the option to see the full details of the record that triggered it. And that's going to include a lot of different information, like the IP address, possibly geolocation information, threat level intelligence, and other information that can help you with your investigation. That entities tab, alluded to it, talked about it a few times, going to continue to. And so that's going to show all those entities that the rules have detected in the last 14 days. Each entity is going to have that activity score as we're seeing on the screen. And that activity score is going to be the sum of all the severity scores of all the unique signals associated with that entity. So when an entity's activity score reaches 12 or higher, that's when the insight will be created. And if you have several entities with high activity scores, that's going to be a good starting point for your threat hunting. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is context actions. Context actions are going to be found throughout the Cloud SIEM UI, and I don't think I showed any of them yet. Yeah, no, I didn't point one out, but the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen is doing a pretty good job for me of showing what this is. These context actions are going to be useful for in-depth investigation. As you can see here, or for example, many entities in the insights, the signals, the entities page, they're going to have these context actions. And the way to utilize them is to hover next to the entity. And when you do, you should see those 6 dots appear. And if they do, and more importantly, if something shows up under those 6 dots, those are going to be the context actions that are available for the object. So for example, the context actions might take the entity and insert it into an API call. It might do a DNS lookup. It might do other tasks as well. And your administrator can set up custom context actions for you. Now, an in-depth investigation, in-depth threat investigation is going to use both Cloud SIEM and Sumo Logic's core tools. And there's going to be several ways for you to bring the information you find in Cloud SIEM back to Sumo Logic platform. And one of those ways is the very obvious way of just cutting and pasting or copying and pasting, but you can get a little more advanced using the context action. And you can use specifically the Sumo Logic search context action. And actually, I think I have a screenshot of it going on right here. And we're going to do this in lab 3. And so what's occurring here is we're taking this IP address that has shown up and has an entity associated with it. And we're going to look through the Sumo Logic log messages to find that entity or find that IP address, and then start to kind of go down that rabbit hole. And so we're going to do this as a lab in a few moments, but just wanted to show you as it's, figured this visual is pretty helpful. All right. Let's see. All right, one more. Yeah, let's do one more slide. We're getting close. Whoop, I was on it. And that last slide here is finishing the investigation. So in Cloud SIEM, there's going to be different actions you can take on each insight. You can comment on the insight, as we kind of saw in Lab 2. You can close it, or you can assign a status to it, as we're going to do shortly in Lab 3. When you close that insight, remember, Cloud SIEM is going to use that resolution information to start to reduce your false positives and duplicates further. So assigning a status assigning a status to the insight lets you keep working on it and also keeps track of your progress. And then you can also assign the insight to yourself or to a colleague, and you can start to use those action buttons to alert the colleague, create the Jira ticket, send a Slack message, other actions. Those actions are also customizable and configured by the admins. Once again, if those things, that customization is interesting to you, the Cloud SIEM administration course goes over it pretty thoroughly. All right. Let's see. Let's take a break now. We're doing pretty good time-wise, so let's do an 8-minute break. I mean, we're good in time. So I'm going to set up a 8-minute timer. I encourage you to take a break, grab a snack, do whatever you want to do. Once we come back, we'll do a few more labs, and then we'll go ahead and take the exam, and you kind of know the drill. So let me just get this started here. All right, so I'll see everybody in about 8 minutes. And if there's questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll get them when I come back, just because I need a break myself. And then we'll continue. So thanks, everybody, and see you all in a few moments. All right, everybody, welcome back from your break. Hopefully you had a good little break. And so let's go ahead and continue. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to our lab guide, and we're going to work on we'll do lab 3A. So with the lab 3A, what we want to do is we want to go back and look at our financial logic example, and we want to use some of the context actions that we identified earlier or showed earlier in the slides. So let's go ahead and do that. So how do we get there, or how do we get back to where we need to be? Many different ways. What you probably easiest to do is just go back to insights, and once again look for that persistence with inertial access. Either search for it, or if you just see one here, I would just grab it. Once again, it doesn't really matter. And so I'm just going to grab, like I said, it doesn't really matter. I'll grab this one. So I want you to be inside an insight. And so we want to use the context action feature now. So on the far left, our entity is this IP address. So this IP address has now been associated with this insight. And what we want to do here is we want to look into Sumo logic and see, do we see this IP address elsewhere? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the 6 boxes that should appear when I mouse over, or mouse kind of to the right of the IP address, the entity. And when I click on those 6 boxes, excuse me, I should have a bunch of different options. As you can see here, I can add to a match list. I can do a Google search. But what we want to do here is a Sumo logic search. When I do that, very simply, Sumo logic is now open. A query is created for me. And that query is going to consist of, very simply, that IP address. It's going to take a moment or two to run just because it's kind of putting it all together. But now what it should show me is, or are those places that this IP address shows up within Sumo logic. Now what we want to do next is we want to go ahead and take the example that's in this lab, and we want to go ahead and do a new log search. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new tab, so plus new and log search. And with the new log search I'm going to do, I want to remember this IP. It should be in the tab next to it. It's also just, here's the IP, but I kind of want to remember that. And so in the new search, what I want to do is take the query that's there, and it might be on 2 pages of the PDF. So you might have to kind of do a little creative copying and pasting here, because if I paste it in, it's probably going to look like this. So I need to get rid of this line and get rid of that. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and place the IP address where it says insert IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that IP address that I said was so easy to remember and I forgot what it was, copy it, and then paste it right there. Now, when I do that, I want to go ahead and click start. This is, so if you get this error, this is when you paste from a PDF, sometimes it's not a good experience. This is not purely a Sumo thing. This is just the way PDFs are. And so I actually have a leading space there. So let me go ahead, and what I'm going to do here is actually just redo the quotes. So I'm going to go ahead and put a new quote in, put another new quote in there. When I do, the text all should turn red. That's really what I want it to look like. And now when I run this, I should get results. As it says in the lab, I may need to change this to the last 24 hours. And so I will. And so what's going to be presented? Why am I doing this? What's the whole point of this? What I'm doing here is I'm saying, take this IP address and look for it within my records that have been ingested into Cloud SIEM. So I'm saying, take my records from in Cloud SIEM, look for this IP address. And when you find this IP address, count by metadata vendor and metadata product, and then transpose that. And what this is starting to show me is, or are those places where this IP address is associated with. So this IP address has been found in Proofpoint as well as CrowdStrike. That's interesting. And so we can start to see what this IP address was doing around this time frame to see if there was something that maybe was not caught within Cloud SIEM. And so it's just another, more data to check, to look at. Now, what we're going to do here is, in this example, we're going to go ahead and go back to the Cloud SIEM tab. And we're now going to use the status to start to wrap up this investigation. So here in the status, we can modify this. We can set it to in progress. We can escalate it. We can go ahead and close the insight. We have just a couple different options of what we want to do. In this case, and just to show you, once you close the insight, you're going to need to select a resolution. And remember, this resolution is important because the system's going to learn based on this resolution. If you set this as a duplicate, that's going to have a different trigger to the system versus as a false positive. So you want to make sure you're accurate with what you put. For today, of course, it doesn't really matter. So you can just go ahead and select any of them. You'd put your comments, and then you close the insight. It might take a moment or two, and now it's closed. And so we see the assignee, or the me, which is the assignee. We see the status is closed. And so that's good. All right. Let's see. Let me go. Let's see. So that completes lab 3. We did 3A, but 3B and 3C are really the exact same step. So it's kind of no reason to do those again. Let's go ahead and let me go back to my slides. I'm going to do probably about 5 or 6 more slides, and then we're going to knock out lab 4, 5, and 6 semi-quickly, and then we'll be done. So let me go back to slides. And let me go specifically to this one. And more specifically, this one. So I want to talk about Cloud SIEM rules. And what we're going to do shortly is start to create some, but first we need to know what they are and what options we have to use when we create them. So what are Cloud SIEM rules? So once you've completed a few investigations, you might want to start to modify or add rules, data sources, match lists, and other pieces of the Cloud SIEM puzzle. These modifications can start to help you further because they can reduce false positives or alert you even faster. And rules are really one of or the most important piece of Cloud SIEM's threat detection engine, easy to say. All the records, as remember, that are ingested in Cloud SIEM are going to be compared to every rule that is in Cloud SIEM. And those records are going to be normalized into log messages. And then if there's a match, that entity is going to be extracted and that signal will be created. And those entities are then tracked and may correlate with other signals to create an insight, which is where most of those threat investigations are going to begin. Now, in regards to the rules, you don't have to write your rules from scratch. The Sumo Logic content team is going to create and maintain hundreds of out-of-the-box rules to get you started. And when we looked at those rules, if you remember, there were 700 and so much. Those were pretty much all Sumo Logic rules built in. Those rules are going to be updated frequently, often every few days. But sometimes you're going to need to write a rule from scratch, and that's what we're going to be covering now. You might do this if your system has a source that isn't covered by the default rules, or if you're looking for a threat that isn't covered by the default rules. Custom rules are not going to be updated or deleted by Sumo Logic, so they're independent from the default rules. And so if you do decide to create custom rules or routine expressions, remember those rules will not be modified or deleted by Sumo Logic's updates, which is good. There's 4 different types of rules. There is a match rule. This is the most simple rule. It's going to take a simple Boolean statement and check if it's true or false. If it's true, then an entity will be extracted and a signal will be created. For example, you might want to look at an IP address and see if it matches a band list. True or false. Very, very, very binary. Threshold rules. These are going to be a little more advanced. These are going to be triggered when a match is found a certain number of times. So for example, and we're going to do this shortly, if you wanted to have, or if you had the decision that one failed login is okay, But 5 failed logins within a 1-hour time period is not good. And after that 5th failed login attempt, you want to be notified or you want to escalate that. That would be a threshold rule. Chain rules. These are going to fire when certain different events happen in a certain time window. For example, if you wanted to look for 5 failed login attempts followed by 1 successful login attempt within 1-hour period, then you would use a chain rule. And then finally, there's an aggregation rule. Those are going to be triggered when up to 6 different events accumulate over time. And you might want to use that type of rule if you want to look for a large number of event types from a single device IP. That being said, we're not really going to cover that type of rule. It's really kind of not unusual to use, but not, yeah, I'll stick with that. It's kind of unusual to use. So when we do our lab, we're going to look at the first 3 types of rules very shortly. Oh, come on. There we go. Now, what I'm showing here is a blank rule template within Cloud SIEM, and you're going to see this shortly. When a rule is created, you need to configure the conditions it's going to match. This is going to be a short piece of code, and it's going to depend on the rule type that we're creating. We can also add rule tuning expressions that are going to be exceptions to the rule appended with an end statement. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, as it shows, it's if triggered. So we're creating a statement that the record needs to match. Now on the right-hand side, when it matches what's going to occur, that signal will be created. And here we can set the conditions for the rule to fire. And we can start to configure that signal that will be created. We can include the name, the entity, the MITRE attack technique or tactic that is going to be used. And more importantly, equally important, we can configure the rule severity score. So that's going to be that score on the 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe. We could set something to a 0 if we want to just monitor something and not create an insight. The higher the severity scores are more likely to trigger insights. Now, when you're creating your custom rules from scratch, there's some best practices that we want you to follow. First is to check the existing rules in the system. As mentioned, Sumo Logic has hundreds of built-in rules, and so you might not need to write a new one. Or you might need to make a small change to an existing rule, like adding a rule tuning expression or adjusting a severity score. You need to know your own system well. You need to know, or at least understand, the schema, the log mappings of all the records that are ingested into Cloud SIEM to write effective rules. And you may need to work with your administrator and the team to write these better rules. As mentioned, Cloud SIEM administration covers the writing of those rules, although we are going to do a few examples shortly. You need to know your systems or your company's risk tolerance, their risk appetite, their priorities. So for example, and kind of we saw that example when we were talking about our fictitious companies, some companies might want to monitor a large amount of outbound traffic, and they might not consider a large amount of traffic to be a threat. So they might assign a large amount of outbound traffic a rule that has a severity of 0. Another company might be concerned about and alarmed about outbound traffic and consider that to be data exfiltration. And so they might give the same exact rule a severity of a 5. One company did a 0, one did a 5. They're both correct, it's just which is more appropriate for the company. We want you to know all the types of rules. If your use case requires a chain rule, but you're using a threshold rule, it's not going to be a good experience. It might not be as efficient, it might not be as effective, it just might not work. And so using the right rule is good. You also want to make small changes to your rule. So for example, with discussing the severity score, let's say you set a severity score to an 8, and you realize that's too high. Don't change it from an 8 to a 2, change it from an 8 to a 7 and monitor a change for a while. Is it still not picking up what you needed to or picking up too much? Then lower it down to a 6 and so on and so forth. So gradual changes are going to be more subtle and easier for you to determine, is it a good change or not? And then the other best practice is saving all new rules as a prototype. And what this allows you to do, or allows the system to do, is monitor the rule's behavior without creating new insights and alerts. Basically a way to test the rule without junking up your system. And so this is strongly encouraged to do. We'll do it as a best practice when we're setting up these rules in a few moments. So you'll get the experience of clicking that button. It's not a great experience, but it's a button to click. All right, a couple more slides. So adding a rule tuning expression to an existing rule is going to be the easiest, most common way for you to customize your rules. That rule tuning expression is that going to be that end statement that you add to an existing rule. It's going to be just simple logic you add to your rules. With rule tuning, you can start to modify those existing rules without rewriting them from scratch, which saves time. Once you've written, there we go. Once you've written a tuning expression, you can apply that tuning expression to multiple rules. You can also apply multiple tuning expressions to each rule, so you have a lot of flexibility. What we're going to do in the labs is we're going to learn how to apply one tuning expression to multiple rules and how to apply multiple tuning expressions to one rule. So once again, one tuning expression to multiple rules and multiple tuning expressions to one rule. And then finally, when you use rule tuning instead of custom rules, your tuning expressions are going to be retained when Sumo updates the rules. So you get the advantage of the rules that Sumo pushes out to all their users, just customized for you. All right. Creating insights. So this is, this is important. This is going to start to get into the math of how insights are created. The next slide gets more mathy, not very technical, but you'll have better imagery here. But what I'm trying to show here is that once a rule is in the system, whether it's a custom rule or one that's been created by Sumo, Cloud SIEM is going to use it to create signals. As mentioned, kind of ad nauseum, if a record matches a rule, an entity is going to be extracted from that record. And that entity, once again, is that IP address, that username, that domain name telling us who. Once an entity is in Cloud SIEM's system, then Cloud SIEM is going to start to track the total severity score of signals associated with each entity as an activity score. So just to repeat that, once that entity is in the Cloud SIEM system, and we saw those entities earlier, we also saw the total severity score of the signals associated with each entity. And once that activity score gets high enough, then an insight is going to be created. Now, what I want to do now is, once again, as I alluded to, kind of show the math that's occurring here. It's not very difficult math, but this visual, I think, is really helpful. So let's take a look at insight clustering. All right. So let's say we have 13 signals in our system from the last 2 weeks, and those are represented by this right-hand side of the screen. Each shape on the slide is going to represent a different signal. Actually, each shape / color is going to represent a different signal. So what we have here are 3 different signals. We have signals that have entity A, which is going to be our pink triangle. We have signals that have entity B, which are going to be the green squares. And then we have entity C, which is going to be the blue circle. So based on the rule that fired, each of these signals has a severity score, which is going to be the number within the object, within the shape. Now remember, by default, an entity needs an activity score of 12 before an insight is created. And the activity score is very simply the sum of all the severity scores from the last 14 days. So of these blue circles, pink triangles, and green squares, which of those signals will cluster into an insight? Remember, the pink triangles have scores or severities of 5, 6, and 7. The blue circles have 1, 1, 2, 2, and 3. And the green squares have 1, 2, 2, 3, and 4. So of those different colors / shapes, which ones are going to cluster into an insight? And if you want to put your guess in the chat, feel free to. If you don't want to play along, that's fine as well. Got some guesses going on. So let's see, Lucas is guessing green and red. Let's see if he's right. So let's look at entity A first. Let's look at the pink triangles. Those pink triangles are going to cluster together into an insight, as Lucas identified. Now, there's only 3 signals there, but they have a relatively high severity score. And the total activity score for entity A, the pink triangles, is 18. 5 + 6 + 7. So those form an insight. Now, the green squares, are those going to cluster into an insight? Their scores are a lot lower, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, but there's a bunch of them. And so in this case, 1 + 2 + 2 + 3 + 4 equals 12. And so that's going to cluster into an insight because the activity score is 12, and we recognize anything 12 or greater to be grouped together into an insight. Now, the blue circles, those won't cluster to an insight. Cloud SIEM is still going to track the entities on the entity tab, but the activity score there is a 10. So until another rule with the severity of 2 or higher triggers with that entity, it will not cluster into an insight. So with that, if it did have another severity of 2, then it would cluster into insight, but in this case it doesn't, it adds up to 10. So what we want to show here, besides the right answers, is the fact that you can have a large number of low severity score signals that don't create an insight. You might have a small number of high severity scores that do create an insight. And so you want to keep this in mind when you're starting to configure those severity scores of your custom rules. All right, 2 more slides. And first one is around custom insight. So what if you want to be alerted right away when a certain rule is triggered, or you don't want to use the default activity score of 12? That's where a custom insight is going to be helpful. That's going to let you create an insight based on one specific signal or a chain of signals, regardless of their severity scores. And this is really going to be helpful for known threats that are specific to your system. And where this is also helpful is you don't need to change any of your existing rules and insights. They keep working normally, so you don't have to adjust your default settings for those activity scores. Now remember, Cloud SIEM's out-of-the-box rules and insights are great, but we want you to have the flexibility to customize your insight and customize your environment, excuse me. And so what we've learned or started to talk about are 3 ways to customize those Cloud SIEM rules or insights. First is through those rule tuning expressions, those simple ways to add small exceptions to existing rules. The second is the custom rules that let you write logic that's unique to your system and that are not covered by built-in rules. And finally, the custom insights allows you to get alerts based on just one rule or a chain of rules. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to create some rules. So we're going to do lab 4, 5, and 6 consecutively. So what I'm going to do is jump back into Sumo Logic. Hopefully I still have it open. I'm going to grab my lab guide and I'm going to start with lab 4. And so with lab 4, we're going to create a rule tuning expression. And so let's go ahead and do so. So why do we want to do this? As a reminder, in this specific example, let's say we're updating, as it says, firewalls in our system, and we don't want to trigger unnecessary alerts. So we want to create a rule tuning expression that's going to allow us to bypass firewall related rules. So how do we create that rule that allows us to bypass those rules? Well, let's do it. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the very top and we're going to go to content. And I'll go back to actually, let me go back to the home screen. I didn't really need to do that. The content button is still in the same spot, but I'm going to go to content and I'm going to go to rule tuning. What I'm going to do here is click create. And during this process, when we're naming these rules, please use the naming convention that we encourage you to use. It makes my life a lot easier when I have to clean this stuff up later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this tuning expression. And the portion that I want you to really focus on is the initials and the number. The formatting doesn't matter too much, but the fact that you put those initials, put those numbers in makes it visually easier for me to find them later. So follow this format or something really close to it. Now, what we've done is we've just named this rule tuning expression. What we want to do first or second is now add the rule that we want to modify. So we're going to go in here and we're going to type our rule and we're going to look for or type the word firewall. We're going to see a bunch of different rules here. The one we want to utilize for today is the one that says training. So we're going to select this AWS network firewall or training. So now we're utilizing this rule. But what we want to do now is we want to go ahead and create an exception to this. We want to have this rule match only specific criteria. And the specific criteria we want to use is when we are identified. So essentially, we are going to be bypassing the firewall rule. Nobody else will. So what we need to do is we need to enter that exception. What I'm going to do is copy that text that's in the lab, and I'm going to paste it into this box here. This is going to be another issue where pasting in PDFs is not great. Even though everything looks okay, what I need to do is I need to remove or modify the apostrophes over here. So I'm just going to redo them and make them red. When I do, the whole string of text turns red. And what I want to do here is now specify my number, 234. So what I'm doing is I'm putting together a rule that says, look, utilize network firewall or training. and look or identify this user email. And more specifically, looking for emails that do not match this. So that's why we're using the exception and using the exclamation point to say, look for emails that don't match this expression. Once we have that done, we're going to click very simply submit. And we should be brought back to this screen. Actually, yeah, we should be brought back to this screen. And what we can do is now we can verify that it's in there. So we can go to content, we can go to rule tuning. And if we, what am I doing here? Yeah, I should see it in here. Content, rule tuning. Let me just refresh it. There we go, cool. And now I see my rule tuning expression and I see yours or some of yours. Should see probably a few more than 5, but nevertheless, I see some of them in there. And you know, feel free to click on each other's, but now you're starting to see those expressions. Very straightforward and intentionally so. What I want to do now is I want to do lab 5, which is we're going to utilize the custom match rules. So why are we going to use the custom match rules? Well, in this case, what we want to do, as it says, is we're concerned about traffic coming from a specific IP address that's not covered by our default rules. So what we want to do is we want to create a match rule that's going to look for a specific IP address. So how do we do that? We go up to content. We go to rules because this time we want to create a match rule. So when we select rules, we're going to see the existing rules. And as described earlier, we see about 700 or so rules that have been created by Sumo. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to create a new rule. So we're going to click create. When we click create on the top right, we now have those rules that I described earlier. This very simple match rules all the way up to the very complex aggregation rules. For today, we're just going to use a couple of them, but the first one we're going to use is a match rule. So we want to select match. Now we're going to go ahead and start to fill in the blanks. As mentioned, for the name, go ahead and please put in something close to match rule JD23. Come on. So I'm putting in my rule or naming my rule to start with. Now I'm going to continue to cut and fill in the blanks. So when the record matches the expression, what do we want it to match? Well, we want it to look for our IP address. And so we're going to specify our local IP address and paste that text in here. Once again, we're going to need to modify those apostrophes just because pasting from PDFs. And so now we have our rule started. So our match rule is going to occur when this device IP shows up. Now, we're going to add a tuning expression to that. The tuning expression we're going to add is the one that we just created in the previous lab. So we're going to say, look for our tuning expression. And now I'm starting to put these together. So now I'm saying, look for this IP address that does not have essentially the email address of training analyst 234. Now, when that all matches, what do I want to have happen? Well, I want to have a signal created, but I need to fill in all these blanks to have that signal created. And that's what we're going to do now. So for the signals, I want the entity to be created or utilized. So I want to utilize that device IP as my entity. I can go ahead and give it a name. I don't really have to. I'll just, as it says here, I'll do signal JB234. The summary and description I can leave blank, or I'll just put test just because. And now I need to put the severity. So when this occurs, is this a low severity? Is it a high severity? For today, it doesn't matter. I'm going to, just because I want to play with the slider, I'll put it up to a 7. In reality, it's probably closer to a 1. And now I can use those tags. And so I can start to use those tactics and techniques from the MITRE framework. Finally, once I have this all done, I want to save this as a rule, as a prototype, because I don't want to generate insights from this. I don't want to screw up my lab environment, essentially. And I should, where's my submit? There it is. I should have my submit. If I can't submit, I might have an exclamation point with a triangle next to submit that has a, that's an, oh, let me show you just what it looks like. So if I'm forgetting something, the system's going to remind me, hey, leaving something out. But once I have everything in assumingly correct, I'm going to click submit. It says the rule has been created successfully. And now I can go ahead and go back to content, go back to rules. And now if I search for my rule, I should see it. I'm going to cheat and just search by created. This is probably by descending. Let's see, this should. Cool. And now I see my match rule and I see Lucas's and etc. All right. Last lab, and this is going to be creating a custom insight. So what we want to do here and why we want to do this is, as it says, we want to be alerted right away when our custom match rule is triggered. So we want to create a custom insight that looks only for this rule. So to create it, we're going to go up to content and we're going to go to custom insights, and we haven't used this yet today. Once again, we're going to see any custom insights that might exist already. In this case, there are none. So we're just going to click create. And now we're going to name them. Kind of know my naming scheme already. And so we're doing essentially the left-hand, right-hand side of the screen. So when signals are created with the following, we want to change this to rules. And then we want to select one or more of the rules. And so in this case, we want to select our rule that we just created. And so there it is. Now I can choose if order matches or matters here. In this case, order just isn't relevant to me. So I'm just going to say, look in any order. And when it does find, or when the signal is created and triggered, then it's going to create that insight. So we can put a description, once again, not very creative. We can specify severity, and we can once again specify our tags. So we can use our tactic initial access again here. And then once again, once we're done with that, we're really just going to click submit. Assuming this is all good, if I go to content and I go to custom insights, and now I see mine and I see yours, and that's good. All right, cool. Let me go back to my slides, but I think keeping us honest, that concludes content. So we did the labs, we did the rotating expression, we did the custom match rule, and we did the custom insight. So certainly any questions, go ahead and ask, but I'm going to do two things. So if there's questions, ask them. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and start to bring you into the exam because that's what we want you to do next. So as a reminder, now is the opportunity for you to take the exam. So to get to the exam, it's important that you log out of this interface. We don't want we don't want training user to get credit for the exam, training analyst, 2, 3, 4, whatever. We want Lucas and Vishal and your named accounts to get credit for the exam. So go ahead and log out and log out of Sumo, and then log in with your personal or private or company credentials. When you log in, and if you know how to already do this, go ahead and start the exam, feel free to. But basically, you'll go to certification. Actually, this is not going to work for me. Let me just log in real fast just so I can show you the experience and make sure you're on the right one. So once again, logging in with my credentials. Clicking on certification, going to get certified. Once I'm in the certification portal, I want to go to my exam. And so what I want to go to is the option that says, kind of tap dancing here, get certified. So I'm going to click get certified. Here, I'm going to see all the exams. The exam that we're concerned about for today is Cloud SIEM fundamentals exam. So this one right here. Go ahead and click on it. If you've done this before, you already click register for free. And then start the exam. The exam is going to consist of 20 questions. You're going to have 60 minutes to take it. As a reminder, this is open book, open reference, open notes, open Google, open Sumo Logic documentation. So please use those resources. Once you're done with the exam, you'll finish it. just want to show this as a reminder. This is this very last step. So you'll take the exam. I know it says you only have one attempt. You have as many attempts as you need. Basically, you'll take it. You'll submit your answers. You'll do better than I did. And then let's see, what you need to do is make sure that you click submit results. So when you get your score, click those submit results in order for the submittal to actually kick in and take place. Let's see what else. That's about it. Let me go ahead and put the link for the Uber Eats, because I know everybody's going to want that after, as you should. So once you're done with the exam, fill out the Uber Eats form and attach your certificate and get free food, which I encourage everyone to take advantage of. So that's going to conclude today's session. I'm going to stay around for while you're taking the exam. Odell and I will hang out for a little bit, but thank you for attending. Hopefully you learned a little something about Cloud SIEM. If you're interested in more or more advanced features, Cloud SIEM admin is going to be the way to go. That's going to get into, as mentioned, ingestion of those records and turning them into messages and doing that first half of the Cloud SIEM pipeline. So, all right. So let's see. I think I'm good on questions. So I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. I'll be hanging out for a little bit. Odell will be as well. I'm going to probably grab another beverage real fast. But thank you again for attending. Take that exam, pass it, get that free food, and attend another class. We will look forward to having you again. So let me go ahead and just kind of shut up here. Like I said, I'll leave this on the screen. And yeah, very good. So thank you again, everybody. And if I need to talk to you in a few minutes, very good. Otherwise, like I said, hope to catch you at the next training.